So, I mean, it's a really interesting and hard question, partly because it requires me to make sense of what I'm doing. And as an interdisciplinary scholar, that's challenging because I work at the intersection and do different kinds of work that kind of coalesce around a particular set of projects. But the most kind of powerful intersections involve memory studies, the history of violence, mass atrocity, and concern with justice, with the kind of moral and representational dimensions of human cruelty. So, you know, I came at this the scenic route. It took me a while to get here. I'm South African. I came to Canada when I was young, and in the late 1970s, just after Soweto, and for political reasons. And I grew up in a household where South African politics, the politics of apartheid, and the questions of justice and fairness figured fairly prominently. My family, although not themselves, my parents were not themselves activists. My extended family, my relatives, my cousins, my uncles and aunts were very involved in movements like the Black Sash. And my close uncle married Bram Fisher's daughter in jail. He was the attorney for Nelson Mandela and was himself in prison. So, and my parents were followed by the security police and so forth. So I kind of grew up in a milieu that was a kind of politically rich one, and one organized in some sense around questions of justice and decency. And my father had been a boy, he lied about his age, during World War II, and he'd been a tail gunner and a bomber in the South African Air Force, and at the very tail end of the war he'd fought his way up Italy, and he loved it. He had an amazing time. He was poor, and the Army gave him things he didn't have in his civilian life, or the Air Force gave him stuff he didn't have in his civilian life. And at the end of the war he didn't want to go home. He didn't want to go home to poverty, so he stayed to demobilize, and he was sent up. He was in northern Italy. He was sent up into Austria to help clean up one of Mauthausen's subcamps. And the experience of his personal experience of the aftermath of the Holocaust sort of added to this terrain, this domestic terrain within which the World War II figured prominently, the Holocaust figured prominently. Our next door neighbors in South Africa were Holocaust survivors, and they were part of our social milieu. So, you know, all this to say is, in some sense, my interest in war and the way we talk about and remember war and mass violence comes out of a kind of, like for me personally, comes out of this embeddedness in a context where it was never far away from the everyday present. And academically, I just became interested. I mean, over time, I just became interested in, as a theorist, as somebody sort of working with bigger picture questions about, you know, what justice is and what history is actually. Like, how do we go about knowing the facts of the matter about the past? We're informed along the way by kind of moments that threw into relief the kind of moral salience of the questions I was interested in asking. So, for example, as an undergraduate, I had a literary arts program that I ran on campus radio at the University of Calgary, and mostly it was just Canadian authors who would come through, and I would talk to them for an hour, and then the show would play later that week after it had been edited. And one time I got a call from a group calling itself the Canadian Free Speech League, and they said they had this very famous historian that they wanted me to meet and to talk to. This is 1988. And they showed up, these four old, German-accented men, bringing with them this British historian by the name of David Irving. And David Irving came into my studio, and I had looked him up. You know, the weird thing was I hadn't known about him, and I had looked up some of his works, specifically his study of Adolf Hitler. And I'd been genuinely puzzled by what I'd read. I'd read it very quickly, but it seemed to me that he had a completely heretical, like, kind of reading of who Adolf Hitler was as a relatively benign figure, not motivated by, in any way, by a kind of profound animus for the Jews, somebody who would rather not have had war thrust upon him by the Allies and so forth, by the British and the French in particular. As we talked, as I interviewed Irving, it was the most extraordinary conversation. I mean, he denied the Holocaust. This is roughly at the time that he was part of this endeavor to sample And Errol Morris talks about this in Dr. Death. I mean, this is part of that moment where Irving was part of the team that was sampling the chemical structure of the bricks in the gas chambers to determine. I mean, their view was that there was in fact no mass gassing of Jewish inmates in death camps, and he was denied. He officially denied the Holocaust, and of course, ultimately, Irving was taken to task for Holocaust denial in a trial involving Deborah Lipstadt that caused a lot of. Where he denied being a Holocaust denier, actually. Although I had him on tape denying the Holocaust, and actually was unable to broadcast the show without first also going to a Jewish historian in the history department at the University of Calgary and having him respond to Irving's account. You know, it wasn't the sort of thing you could just play and leave unanswered, you know. So I played Irving for one show, and then the next show I had David Berkeson come in and sort of explain all of the reasons why what Irving was doing was wrong. I mean, I think shortly after he had validated the legitimacy of the Hitler diaries, which were subsequently found to be forgery. So anyway, it's moments like that where all of a sudden questions about, you know, what the past is, how we know the past, our dependence upon language to make, and various representational devices to make sense of the past sort of assumed for me a kind of moral urgency, because of course people's suffering and recognition of that suffering kind of in some important sense hung in the balance. And then additionally, I mean, I think questions of redress, what do we do once we recognize someone's suffering, sort of hung in the balance of this. And so, you know, I'd worked, when I became a professor, I worked a little bit. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was winding down in South Africa. It was starting to release its first unedited collections of transcripts, and I was looking at the language of testimony a little bit. I'd seen in the TRC not what many critics had seen as a kind of success, but I'd seen a failure. I'd been interested in the work of people like Martin Meredith, who had sort of seen the way in which the Truth and Reconciliation process had mattered so much more to black Africans, black South Africans, than to white South Africans. And this was the black South Africans who were listening to it on the radio, who were tuning into the giving of testimony, while white South Africans largely ignored the process. I mean, with the exception of a small liberal minority in the country. But basically, the process hadn't worked especially well to bring the country together. And then, of course, through the amnesty process, it had allowed perpetrators like Winnie Mandela, Eugene de Kock, many other kinds of state security operatives to simply by acknowledging their crimes, receive amnesty from the government in a way that didn't seem really to do justice for the families of those who, or actually those who had even survived the beatings, the mutilations, and the imprisonments, the torture. So, you know, I started getting interested in, I sort of stayed interested, I suppose, in these questions, and then eventually, over time, I sort of worked on I worked with colleagues at the University of Manitoba to talk. We started a Representations of War research cluster that brought these questions into a kind of more narrowly academic frame, and put a book together that explored these issues from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. And out of this, I became very interested in the rich scholarly tradition of thinking through these issues in relation to the Holocaust. So I had a couple of fellowships at the USHMM in DC, went down, learned more about the Holocaust, started working in their archive, became interested in photography, Holocaust photography, particularly the perpetrator photographs. I became fascinated with the photographs of Walter Genevine, the Austrian accountant in the Łódź ghetto, who was also an amateur photographer. And even at the height of the scarcity of chemicals available for color slide development, somehow managed to obtain AGFA slide stock and have it developed by military authorities of photographs he was taking officially to document the productivity of Łódź, which was supposed to be a kind of industrial showpiece for the Nazis. But unofficially, he was an amateur photographer. He was taking these beautiful images of conditions of genuine hardship and distress. And so they're quite extraordinary images, and I became really sort of fascinated with the problem of beauty in these photographs, and this is something I continue to think about and work through. You know, like, what does it mean to be engaged aesthetically by representations, by people who want us to see the world in a way that is profoundly morally objectionable, right? Or what does it mean to refuse to be attracted to other people's suffering in ways as well, right? Like, and to be simply repelled by it is to not see, in some sense, to not see fully either, right? So as a spectator, we're in this odd kind of tension with respect to human suffering, where on the one hand it doesn't feel quite right to look too closely, on the other hand it's absolutely wrong to turn away. So how do we position ourselves, especially within the frame of a kind of perpetrator representation, so that we can see what we need to see without being and having our own frames of reference dominated by the perpetrator's own frame, the kind of way in which he or she not just delimited the world by framing it, but also focalized it so that we were sort of conditioned to look in a particular direction at the individuals or circumstances he or she depicts. So, you know, from there it wasn't a big step to start, especially in the wake of having children, amongst other things, growing up in a city like Winnipeg, which is not only multiracial but has an extremely high urban Indigenous population, you know, and you want your children to grow up alongside Canada's Indigenous people in a way that is healthy and productive and doesn't sort of inherit much of the racist baggage that's part and parcel of settler Indigenous relations everywhere, but in Canada too. And so I got interested in, and partly in conjunction with the operations of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation process, which was attempting to make sense of the legacy of the Indian residential school system in Canada, all of which was taking place alongside the first discussions about what the new Canadian Museum for Human Rights was going to be, because that opened in 2014 in Winnipeg, but it was preceded by vigorous debates about, amongst other things, the prominence being given to the Holocaust in that location, and the Holocaust alongside, because there are two permanent galleries in the museum. One is reserved for the Holocaust, the other is reserved for Indigenous rights, right? But to have those be the two fixed points of reference in the museum sort of brought together my concerns, and alongside an interest in the truth and reconciliatory process as potentially a failure, in the same sense that the South African one, I viewed the South African one to be a failure, brought me into a set of discussions and some advocacy work too on behalf of the museum, which I thought was justified in keeping the Holocaust, or giving the Holocaust prominence in this context. Got me talking to curators and eventually organizing a lecture series through the law school, co-organizing it with colleagues in law and sociology, which became the book on the museum, which just appeared about a month ago. So another called The Idea of a Human Rights Museum. And from that, we just became interested. My friends and colleagues became collaborators as we started to struggle with a question the curators in the museum were struggling with, is like, how do we represent not merely Indigenous history, but Indigenous trauma in a way that is at once decolonized, right? That's sort of free from all of the kinds of prejudices that have informed Europeans' understanding of Indigenous life, and yet still can speak to settler Canadians as they work towards something like reconciliation, which is a term I'm suspicious of only because I don't think we agree what it means. So that brings me up to the present in a way, because the Embodying Empathy project, this virtual Indian residential school we're working on, is really a kind of critical and creative project that's a culmination of years worth of work thinking about what museums, especially ideas museums that are tech dependent in a lot of ways, what they're able to do to bridge the distance between victims of atrocity and secondary witnesses to that atrocity. What do these technologies actually aid or fail to do in relation to the representational demands of Indigenous suffering?
What would it mean for a reconciliation process to work? Have you ever seen it work?
It's okay. So this is, as I say, we don't agree about what reconciliation is, and actually colleagues of mine, some of whom are connected to Embodying Empathy in important ways, but are doing different kinds of work, are just in the process of gearing up a kind of major project to sort of explore the idea of reconciliation. And obviously, we've seen truth and reconciliation commissions in Chile, Argentina, around the world, right? Not just South Africa. And yet, we had a representation from the Museum of Human Rights in Santiago come through the University of Manitoba fairly recently. We were talking about reconciliation and what their role is in sort of promoting reconciliation there. And they were explaining that actually the government still hasn't released a huge amount of archival material that would actually make the truth of the reality of the military dictatorship and its crimes available to the broad mass of the public, that could then be sort of processed, digested, and talked about in a way that would allow the public and the community to knit itself together and work through. In other words, notwithstanding these processes, these formal governmental processes of supposedly truth and reconciliation, we never quite get enough truth, and the idea of what reconciliation needs to be in the wake of whatever is disclosed is never kind of fully articulated either. I mean, we fall back on mystical notions like Ubuntu, and which is the South African term that Desmond Tutu used to talk about a kind of like a particular form of well-being and healing. Justice, like a particular idea of justice, an indigenous idea of justice, and we still, like, I mean, we're playing the synonym game. We're not any closer to really figuring out pragmatically what we need to do. So where have we seen reconciliation occur? Like, I'm not sure that we have. Not in a sense that allows for a kind of letting go and a putting behind. I mean, I'm mindful of something the Dutch writer Harry Muller once said about World War II. You know, he says that we'll know we've put World War II behind us. In other words, reconciled ourselves to it when parents start naming their children Adolf again. You know, and there's a sense in which we haven't. You know, whatever reconciliation is, it takes place in different registers, large and small, and the kind of formal mechanisms of reconciliation don't guarantee the kind of knitting together that allows us collectively, and in a particularly restricted sense, to forget the past. So one of the things I'm interested in working on next, and I've been thinking about in a kind of unstructured way, and it's going to sound horrible, but I don't mean it horribly, but I think that actually at the end of the day, like what I understand reconciliation to require is actually a very strategic form of forgetting. And so all of our culture is organized around remembering, right? And I think there's forms of remembering that always need to be active and intact. So we need institutional memory. We need, and by which I mean we need libraries and museums and archives to operate and hold traces of the past that are accessible and we can work on, right? But at the level of cultural memory, I think so long as we have a kind of active memory, like active memory in the day-to-day sense of past trauma, then we haven't resolved the past, we haven't reconciled ourselves to the past, and we haven't moved on in a way that suggests that we're still being damaged. And so what's interesting is, and this comes out of some commentary that colleagues of mine have done with reference to Rwanda, where they've talked to Rwandan genocide survivors who are living alongside their Hutu neighbors, right? And so the question that these people have asked these survivors is, how do you do that? What do you talk about with your neighbor? And you know what they say? They say, we just try not to remember. We just, like, in other words, the precondition for their peaceful coexistence is never talking about the past and not remembering it in a way that complicates the present. It's the only thing that makes that possible. And I think, so they're okay with that. Those survivors are okay with that. They don't feel like they have to because they're being coerced into that. And I wonder, as a question, if in fact, like in some more general kind of claim needs to be made about reconciliation is importantly involving forgetting, even as our institutions and our kind of official memory consolidates and stays actively engaged in the processes of memory. We tend to think of ourselves as always needing to remember, never forget. But that's Santayana, right? Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it, but we know that's not so. The past doesn't repeat itself. I mean, Mark Twain was right, it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So we don't need to remember it exactly, we just need to be sensitive to echoes and then sort of deal with the present manifestation of injustice in ways that are specific to that injustice and perhaps don't evoke the past in ways that are counterproductive. I mean, Dirk Moses talks about this, the Australian historian, post-colonial historian, talks about this in relation to Israel and Palestine when he talks about the terror of history. That's what he calls it, the terror of history. And he says, the specter of the Holocaust is so profound in Israeli kind of public memory that it makes any attempt to deal with a self-avowed enemy of the state an existential issue that immediately forestalls kind of moderate positions on issues that are actually finally resolvable. So.
I spoke to an Indonesian woman whose family had been a victim of the communist purges, and she learned about the purges when she came to graduate school in the United States. Otherwise, there were strange myths about ghostly floating heads. That was the full story that she had as an educated woman. Now, you make a distinction between, a space for remembering and a space for forgetting. What is exactly the case for there being an academic archival space for remembering? I mean, for things like the hair and shoe collection at the Holocaust Museum.
There's debate about things like the shoes, or at the USHMM, the boxcar, right? Philip Gurevich talks about how walking in that boxcar makes him feel like he's being asked to lie down in someone else's coffin. There's something uncomfortable and disquieting about it. So, I don't think there's an easy answer to that in a lot of ways, and I don't think it's forgetting first. Like, that's just to be really clear. Like, I think I'm talking about, and I think anamnesis, right? Like, that's the idea of forgetting. I'm talking about different registers, like different locations of memory. And I think there's popular memory, there's personal familial memory, there's institutional official memories, right? Like, these are all different memory cultures that work and circulate memory through different agents and sites and locations, right? Using different techniques of representation. The case for official remembering, I think, is really sort of tied to juridical claims and larger sort of justice claims and claims about compensation, right? So determining, for example, who perpetrators are and punishing them under the law, that's something that requires a kind of memory that is supported by personal memory, but not necessarily cultural memory, but certainly supported by personal memory in the form of testimony that needs to remain active so long as there are individuals to prosecute and rights and wrongs to put right. There's no question that has to be done. But I think, what do we do 2 generations past a tragedy when all of a sudden the kind of immediate victims are gone, and the secondary victims, right, the children of these immediate victims, have also, no doubt, in all kinds of ways been damaged by these experiences, but their aging and their needs are, and their desire for any kind of justice is also ebbing and fading as well. At what point do, how heritable are and durable are these kinds of justice claims? We see in America, for example, claims occasionally made that, or asserted that there needs to be compensation for slavery, right? There needs to be recompense for slavery. Now, there's no question that the legacy of African American racism endures in formal and informal ways, in all kinds of ways in this country. But there's also, I think, a countervailing sense that there's a point beyond which that particular kind of claim for justice, that form in which that argument about justice takes, is maybe not the best one. So, there's no algorithm for this. There's no rule for this. I just think that if we're going to talk about something like reconciliation and try to figure out how it's supposed to operate, we have tended to focus on reconciliation, and it's partly its indebtedness to a kind of Freudian therapeutic paradigm that requires us to sort of speak out in order to work through, right? That, so we focused on memory as a kind of crucial core component of reconciliation. But I wonder if we shouldn't also be in some way exploring the demands of forgetting and trying to figure out how to structure or organize forgetting in ways that are actually productive and not conducive to denial. I mean, that's another reason for official memory, right? We want to forestall denial. We want to sort of have the record show that atrocities were what they, or are what they were, right? That they had this particular form, they were caused for these reasons and had these effects. Like, we need that. But, there's a way in which if I hate my neighbor because, there was a time in which he tried to kill me, I'm still trapped within a kind of a moral and social economy that is holding me back.
I'm something of an outsider, and I think the outsiderhood probably has roots in the Irish potato famine. The fairly serious attempt that was made by the British to kill my ancestors in order to dominate what was essentially a colony. and the sense that my people left the folks in charge because the folks in charge were trying to kill them. And me as a videographer talking to you as a professor with some standing, I never, there is a shadow of that, surely. And yet at the same time, I mean, here is an atrocity far enough in the past that one is capable of forgetting it. It can be passed. It can be distanced. I never told my kids about the potato famine. It would be simply an academic curiosity for them if they were to look at it now. So part of the issue is that a success? Is that the kind of success we want?
Well, I mean, that a later generation can look at the suffering of an earlier one and get some appreciation for not merely the kinds of personal costs involved, but also some deeper understanding of the historical reasons or precedents that made such an atrocity possible, the various outcomes that sort of went on to shape the contemporary Irish political landscape. Like to be able to do that in an atmosphere free from either guilt or a kind of recriminatory impulse seems like it's likely to generate more wisdom, more insight, and more reliable judgment. So that I think that's all to the good. The Irish, though, I say that my middle names are Patrick and Dooley. Like I'm actually half Irish, and actually have Irish citizenship. I have an Irish passport. So the Irish don't forget. They're not a nation of forgetters, And we see this every marching season. And there's exactly an example where, partly because of the dependence of identity on memory, and this is where it gets really complicated, What you get are very different understandings of what it means to be Irish coming into a kind of tension that's profoundly indebted to the past in ways that make the imagined possibility of a shared future together at times seem impossible, right? I think that's an obstructive a kind of memory that is exactly the sort that I would sort of encourage a little more forgetting to apply to.
Yeah, one thinks also of Sicily.
Oh yeah, the Balkans, right? There are places in the world where memory occupies a kind of pride of place in ways that end up, I think, ultimately privileging events in the past at the expense of the future that degrades the present, and yet I think for a variety of again personal, social, and institutional reasons, claims by the Armenians, for example, that the Turks remember properly are completely legitimate. As I say, I don't think you get to forgetting before you've remembered. But I think if you just keep remembering and don't cultivate forgetting, you get bogged down in the past. It's in ways that is potentially, in some cases, not all cases, but conducive to the emergence of this terror of history that makes you judge your future prospects in light of circumstances in the past that no longer obtain in that form in the present.
So one thing you're thinking about doing going forward is thinking about cultivating a certain kind of cultivated forgetting.
I'm thinking about these two things sort of side by side in a way. I'm thinking about, first of all, partly because I'm involved in a memory project with survivor testimony that's part of an attempt by survivors of Indian residential schools to alert the wider Canadian public to the specific character of their suffering, which I and many others take to be genocidal, right? That's a symptom of a kind of genocidal process. So by illuminating the interiority of these experiences, by trying to embed people in a kind of environment, an immersive digital environment where, let's just use the term virtual reality to sort of account for it, right? That term's contested, but let's just say it's going to be as transparent as we can make it. It's going to be as dynamic as we can make it, so it won't be a static world. People will move through it as though it were the real world. We're hoping to illuminate features of the past in the present that animates memories that we think can do important work activating politically salient, morally salient empathy, right? That's the goal of that project. So even as I think about like how to do that, I'm also thinking about the next step, which for me presumably is like once we know, right, and once people have been recognized, and once justice has been done, right, like once we've compensated, we've restituted, we, you know, by lights that are shaped by a full acknowledgement of the suffering in the past, then what sense does it make to continue at the level again of kind of social memory, to continue to think about the past at the expense of present that maybe is more accessible to us through strategic forgetting? Maybe not forgetting everything. Maybe there's some parts of that experience that we can just say, okay, we know it happened. We've sorted out our demand for recognition and justice in relation to what happened. We don't need to revisit that now, because it's a bit like pulling the scab off a wound. And they did, you know, they did studies in the wake of 9/11. Actually, there's quite an interesting literature on this, and they found that of the first responders who received trauma counseling in the wake of 9/11, of the first responders who were active during 9/11, those who received trauma counseling, where they were required to revisit the kind of scene of their trauma, revisit what they did that day, what they saw that day, and so forth. They suffered more and longer than people who didn't seek out trauma counseling and were allowed simply to, and they were no doubt distressed, but who were allowed to basically forget. So, you know, who's healthier, right? How do we promote health? What is kind of health in the wake of these kinds of events? You know, I think there's at least an argument to be made that it requires a certain kind of forgetting.
Thank you.